Serious, Redditors who were once homeless. What was the scariest, creepiest part about being out in the streets? Spent 2007 to 2012 homeless. Most of that was my teenage years spent with my father, also homeless. The scariest thing is spending the evening in some homeless shelters, or out of them in this case. I was in one in Portland, Maine. My dad was assigned a spot to sleep on the floor because they were overcrowded that day. They didn't have a spot for me, so I slept across the street in the garden of the local Catholic church since the priests don't kick people out. It was a popular place to sleep when the shelter was overbooked. I remember sleeping in the grass near a couple whom I overheard talking about robbing me for well over 20 minutes. I didn't let go of my knife all night. The most surreal moment was a short stint in 2010. When I walked into the 400 square foot studio apartment my dad had finally been able to afford for a short while, and asking him, "This is all ours?" We lived like kings that few months. The thought that someone would find your camp and ruin your crap was a real concern. Also, just finding some here to sleep that is secure. One morning, early, I was sleeping in an abandoned warehouse up a set of stairs nearly in the rafters and was woken by 4 raccoons like 4 feet from me eating my bag. Having to crap in the middle of the night is also awful. Being homeless is only scary for a couple of days. There's depression and boredom that are your real enemies. Your body and mind go into a sort of hyper survival mode and there is no room for fear. When I was 12-13 I used to have to avoid home due to a parent using M and the people that they brought by. So I used to sleep in our childhood tree fort the first few times. Up into the woods about a half mile off the road, and up a hill. It was a good vantage point in case I heard anything. One night I woke up and looked out to just see a guy staring up at the fort, and I froze and held the gaze and slowly lay down onto my back. I heard him walk closer and just thought to yell, "Dad, wake up, someone's coming up." He darted off into the woods, but had I not thought to say that, who knows. My dad lived 2 states away and the only bluff I knew to yell. From that point on I found a friend's attic loft and told him my life situation, so he let me stay there at times. Being snuck into a warm place to sleep out of the snow at times is a magical warming level of love. Glad I had that friend. How little you matter to anyone. There are 2 kinds of people I learned to avoid very quickly: groups of young men, teenagers, and fellow homeless men. If someone's gonna frick with you, they'll fall in one of these groups, and people may watch disapprovingly, but they won't do anything to help you. It's less important to most people that you be somewhere safe or with a bit of shelter from the weather than it is that you be where they don't have to see you. Most of your interactions with people such as the police, who in normal life you consider to be concerned primarily with your safety, when you're homeless are more about making you less inconvenient to others. Everyone is gonna try to steal from your butt, so watch your crap. Keep your mouth shut and find a good place that is desolated from nocturnal animals and buttholes. Bugs. I used to sleep behind dumpsters, and the fear of roaches crawling on me in my sleep was enough to make sure I only slept 2-3 hours. Made me try to find hospital bathrooms and just lock the door for 5-6 hours. The hopelessness and pressure of knowing the longer you spend homeless, the harder it is to get out of it. At least that's what I got from the people I talked to. I was homeless for a summer, but really I was just a kid having an adventure and I didn't feel good at home. Talking to people whose parents were homeless and had no life skills, or those with addiction who had no support to help them kick it and get back on track, or people who no longer knew how to even begin to find a job scared the crap out of me. I realized that a couple years of that and you would have to work super freaking hard to get out of it. I was never a super freaking hard worker. I moved out at 15 and lived near Muskegon, Michigan. Tried to avoid it, but that's where possible jobs and rides were, so I went there to better myself. Was homeless for about a year and just couch surfed. Stayed with random people or just slept in abandoned buildings or parks. Scariest part was knowing that once the sun started going down, I had to lay low and find a place to crash for the night. Walking the streets of Muskegon after dark is freaking awful, especially when you're young. People tried to rob me, take advantage of me, sell me drugs, which I took, then follow my whereabouts, chase me just for fun. It was awful. I wouldn't even have anything on me except my clothes and someone would come up with a gun or knife and tell me to give them everything I had. One time when I couldn't give a guy anything, he beat the crap out of me just for fun and cut my arm up bad. Worst time of my life. All the people who assume you'll sleep with them for money. I was a young man at the time and I would get propositioned daily, mostly by creepy ass old men. The scariest bit would probably have been knowing that someone could kill you and no one would really care. RP. It happens in being a homeless individual. Yes, it's usually women but I'm not discounting men. Means that you are very vulnerable and cops generally just turn a blind eye. I had really bad PTSD after Vietnam, and I spent about 4 years basically homeless. When I was in the rough, the thing that got to me the most was the total lack of any kind of privacy. I looked for places to hide, but I never felt really safe. The constant vulnerability just seemed to build and build. It was really hard to maintain like any kind of normal human. Winter. So true, it's not even funny. I was once caught out in some terrible winter weather and thought I was dying of hypothermia. You don't know what cold is until your lips go blue and there's a noticeable delay in thinking move your arm and your arm actually moving. As a girl, the constant sexual harassment and RP threats. I was always in the hood when I was homeless. Guys blocking your way to leave with their trucks to ask you to suck their dong for $15, and if you say no they drive in front of you even more if you try to leave. Just knock his side mirror off and run. A little while ago I was mentally ill in a bout of substance abuse and I ended up on the streets of Brooklyn. The scariest thing to me was how quickly I lost hope and how quickly I became invisible. Suddenly I could easily see how a perfectly normal person could make one wrong move in life and end up homeless for years if not decades. Luckily for me I caught a break, ended up in a psych ward after a short time homeless and had a few contacts to get me home to New England. I hate the dark. It's stupid I know, but I always felt like something was coming for me. I always had to find a corner and hide from the other homeless. I don't know if I had to hide, but I was very young and I'm a girl and I'd had my head filled with how every unsupervised girl got RP'd repeatedly. I thought I would literally be RP'd to death if anyone found me. On the upshot I rule at hide and seek, and I can almost sleep well outside of a corner. I was only homeless for a short stint, but hands down the hardest thing was the constant fear my dog would get taken from me or that he would be hurt. I have a small white dog who weighs a little under 10 pounds and I was always terrified someone would try to take him. Either homeless people or people who thought they deserved him more than my homeless self. Thankfully I had a crappy car at the time, so I had a place to sleep. At night I'd do my best to park at 24-hour gyms or with a for sale sign in the windshield because I was less likely to be asked to move along that way. I was working part-time and my friend worked with animals, so quite often she would bring my dog to work with her since it was allowed. Other days I spent what little money I had on doggy daycare coupons. We made it through and my dog is still mine. As soon as I had money in the bank I took him to a vet and got him all taken care of, and I am typing this from my very own bed with him next to me. I used to sell services to random guys which helped me get out of being homeless after a few months. I'm not gay, but I was desperate to get out of my predicament and did what I had to. I'm a pretty feminine looking man when I had long hair, and that attracted a lot of old men. Lonely men. Just randoms. Never really had problems with other homeless people because I stayed in a local city shelter at night and had to leave during daytime. Hanging around convenience stores and parking lots where they have game rooms, slot machine rooms, is where I got most of my clients. Most of them were chill, get what they want and leave. Some were crazy. One guy in particular wanted me to stay at his place overnight and spend the next day with him for a $1,000. I decided cool and we went to his house. The guy had what I can describe as like a torture frick dungeon in his garage. He had some type of black filament with egg cartons all over the walls and BDSM type stuff laying around. I decided it wasn't a good idea and said I changed my mind, but he wouldn't let me leave. We were yelling back and forth and he punched me in the collarbone. It didn't hurt, probably because of adrenaline. I used to do Kyokushin karate as a teenager, so after he hit me, I kicked him as hard as I could in the balls and kneed him in the temple and ran out the house. I ran from block to block hiding because I was afraid he would try to kidnap me or call the cops. I never saw the guy again even after going back to the spots I always hang out at. I eventually made enough money to get an apartment and eventually a logistics job for a supply chain. Being caught on a bench outside trying to sleep during a hurricane. Finding a safe place to sleep. As a kid and a girl, I just didn't feel safe sleeping at nighttime. Ended up staying awake at nights wandering around in well-lit places, finding places to sleep during the day, either at school, hospital or rooms or parks, beaches with a lot of people. Homeless whilst addicted to amphetamines in the 90s. My mum had to lock me out the house as I was stealing anything and everything. I was a complete C. Anyway, I ended up sleeping in abandoned buildings, bus stops and drug dealing crap holes. I saw some crap I don't ever want to see again. Junkies injecting into their neck. People just in the lowest possible conditions of humanity. It was truly hellish. Was once in this drug house and a guy burst in with a stun gun shouting he wanted anyone's money and drugs as he was going to be sent to prison once the police caught him, so he had nothing to lose. The saddest thing was this. The guy who sold the drugs in that house. It was his home. He lived there 24/7. It was bare floors, bare walls, no cooker, no fridge, no electricity or water. It was living in third world conditions. I once witnessed his ex-girlfriend come and drop his kid off with him. As she sat in the lounge waiting for him, he was injecting speed in another room. I think in that period I saw some truly depraved and degenerate things. Been a lot more cynical about people since then. I was homeless short term, about 2 months, and was fortunate enough to have a vehicle and a minimum wage job, so my experience wasn't nearly as bad as some. The scariest part for me was being an 18-year-old who didn't know her way around too well and trying to find a semi-safe place to park for the night. I'd wake up every few hours to go move my car to another place to try to avoid suspicious vehicle reports. The scariest moment was about 2 AM in a Lowe's parking lot. I woke up to someone parked in front of me with their brights shining right into my windshield. I didn't know what to do, so I just huddled further down and pulled a blanket over my head and hoped for the best. Thankfully nothing came of it. Since then I've realized that a lot of the places I stayed were in really bad areas. I'm extremely lucky nothing happened to me. I'd say next to that the scariest part was trying to stay clean enough to work, go to school. I was always fearful someone would come into one of the public restrooms while I was washing my hair in the sink. It happened once. I was cornered by a couple of women who came in and wanted to know why I was washing my hair, if I was alone, etc. I had to literally duck between them to get out. Ran like mad with my head full of hand soap. I don't know if they were well intentioned or not, but it was terrifying. Not good times. My family was homeless for about 3 months when I was 14, so I only have a kid's perspective. Long story short, my cokehead sister fooled my parents into moving into her crack hut with her and her family, and things just plummeted immediately from there. My sister somehow managed to get access to my parents' bank account and drained their checking and savings account. My parents had absolutely no money. Crap went down and my sister and her husband kicked us out of the house. My parents weren't on the lease, so we had to leave. Hardly any money. We didn't know anyone else, so we went to a motel, and that was where we were for 3 months. It's not necessarily on the streets, but there's still that sense of unknown and fear you won't get out of your current situation. And it was hard because motels cost money as well. So my parents were probably paying about $400 a week to stay in a motel, which was probably a third of their weekly income combined. All the while struggling to save up for the down payment on a house, feed me, and eventually 4 kids, my sister's kids, and more. Being a kid and having no control over my situation and the unknown was the scariest part. I was worried my parents would be at risk of having me taken away because they weren't providing enough for me. I didn't resent them, by the way. They were doing what they could. Or worse, I was worried eventually we wouldn't be able to afford to stay in a motel. It was also embarrassing. Our old apartment wasn't too far from the motel we were staying in, so I went back to taking my usual bus home from school, and the bus stopped right in front of the motel. So I'd awkwardly stand around and wait for the other kids to walk home before turning around and going into the motel. Most people subconsciously believe that there are less consequences involved in killing a homeless person than a regular person. I was hit as a pedestrian by someone who ran a red and then left 4 dead because who cares, right? Long story short, I was living in a house and was kicked out by the landlord with no notice. The scariest part about being homeless for me was having to give up my dog. He was my best friend. first pet, and only means of mental comfort. On top of it all, I had to give the shelter my last $100 as an abandonment fee because I wanted him to have a chance at finding a new home rather than dumping him off in the wild. I cried like a baby in front of everyone. Was homeless, squatting in an office building with motion detector lights that turn on at 1 AM when no one was supposed to be in the building. Then hearing footsteps go past the room you're crashing in. Frick that. Also, the cold. Not quite scary or creepy per se, but when the heating's off, it's winter, it's Wales, the radiator slowly loses its warmth. You're wearing 3 jumpers and 3 pairs of socks but the cold buries itself into your chest. It's so cold the bones in the top of your feet hurt like heck and you don't know if you should be worried about that. And you're scared you won't sleep because the floor's so hard and you can't stop shivering but you need to sleep if you want to escape this nightmare existence. Also knowing that the people you never thought you could relate to but now identify with are doing worse. In the freezing rain, not with a lot of the knowledge you've sadly now got, and washed, addicted to H, proud Swansean, and dying. Also, having to rely on Redditors to donate razors. I pray I never have to return to that existence, and that no one reading this should suffer it. Also, foxes. I love them. But waking up under a shop alcove to what sounds like a dying woman, vixen in heat, is scary as frick. Crows at night make the same noise as the predator stalking its prey in the movie, that crackly sound. You can't sleep for too long for a number of reasons. 1. If it's on concrete and you stay still too long, you get bruises. Too long a time asleep equals more risk of someone finding you who isn't going to be nice. 3. Risk of hypothermia if you stay too cold too long. Health is constantly being taxed. Infection is a much bigger risk. Infection will frick you up. Usually, if someone wants to kill or kidnap you, you won't be in a position for people to know about it. A scary thought is that you could disappear and die before anyone even knows you're in trouble. Though that can certainly happen in all walks of life and scenarios though. No real safe place. When you have no home, you have nowhere to hide or run to when you're in trouble. I lived in a mix of cars, a van, and on the streets themselves for around a year in my teens. One night when I was sleeping in the back of my van, which had a broken door so it couldn't lock, one of the other street workers ripped open my door and started threatening me and demanding I give her the money I'd made that night. I said I hadn't worked that night so had no money. I can't remember if this was a lie or not, and that got her to go away long enough for me to leave my van unnoticed. But then, there was nowhere to go. It was the middle of the night, there was someone who wanted to beat me up. She'd already given me a smack and taken money off me before cause I'm not a fighter at all and she was much bigger and tougher, and robbed me, and there was no one who cared or could help. It's a pretty tough thing to deal with. You really feel alone, completely separate from society, like you're not on the same level as other people. I eventually ended up finding a 24-hour internet cafe and the workers let me hang out in there all night, and the next day, I still had to go back to my van. As a young woman, men offering to help and then realizing their intentions were actually sexual. Let's get you something to eat, some clean clothes, go back to my place, and even creepier, men trying to buy me, not just for a night but like as a long-term deal. One guy just pulled out a roll of bills while I was sitting in the sidewalk and started at $500. Kept upping the number every time I said no. I ran once I realized he wasn't listening and possibly wasn't going to take no for an answer. I now carry cards for the local women's safe place and hand them out to women I see on the streets. Glad that's not my life anymore. You've been stopped by the bread cat. Like this video or he'll eat all your bread. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video, or don't. Either way, have a great day you magnificent people.